The creature in the dark the night was cold and heavy, filled with the smell of smoke and burnt metal. The sky above the destroyed alien village was a deep black, with only a few dying fires giving off a weak orange glow. Shadows stretched over the broken streets, and every sound seemed louder than it should be. Sergeant Daniel Cole moved carefully, his boots crunching on shattered glass and loose stones. He was alone, separated from his unit after a sudden attack earlier in the day. His rifle hung at his side, but his other hand was ready to lift it at the first sign of danger. Every broken building, every alley felt like it could hide an enemy somewhere in the darkness. A pair of eyes was watching him, small, frightened eyes that belonged to someone hiding under the remains of a fallen wall. The owner of those eyes was a young alien girl, no older than 10 by human years. Her thin body was covered in dirt, her clothes torn, and her skin had the faint, natural glow of her people. She had been told stories about humans since she could speak. Stories that painted them as monsters, giants with sharp teeth who stole alien children in the night. When she first saw Daniel's shadow moving through the smoke, her heart froze. The shape of his armor, the strange glowing visor on his helmet, all matched the monsters from the stories. She curled deeper into the rubble. Holding her breath, she told herself to stay still, to not make a sound. Daniel paused. Sensing movement nearby, he slowly turned his head. Scanning the ruins, a faint shiver of movement behind a pile of stones caught his eye. He didn't know what it was, an enemy, survivor, or just his imagination, but instead of raising his rifle, he took a step forward. Then stopped. The girl's heartbeat pounded in her ears. If the monster got closer, she would run. She didn't know where, but anywhere was better than being caught. She expected him to roar, to attack, to bare his teeth like in the stories. Instead, Daniel slowly reached for something on his back, not his weapon, but a rolled-up army blanket. He crouched down so his tall frame was smaller, less threatening. Then he placed the blanket on the ground. Not too close, but close enough for her to reach if she wanted. His voice was calm, low, almost gentle. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand. He pointed at the blanket, then at her, then pushed it slightly toward her. The girl blinked in confusion. Why would a monster give her something warm? She stayed. Still not trusting him, Daniel didn't move closer. Instead, he removed his helmet slowly, showing his face, a tired, dirt-smeared human face. Not a creature with sharp teeth. He set the helmet down beside him and looked around as if guarding her from something unseen. The cold wind cut through the broken walls, making the girl shiver. Her small hands rubbed her arms, trying to bring back some warmth. Her eyes kept flicking to the blanket. She wanted it badly, but the fear of the monster's trap kept her in place. Daniel could see she was freezing. He remembered the photo in his pocket, the smiling face of his own daughter back home. He thought of what she would look like if she were alone in the cold, scared of someone she didn't understand. He took a slow breath and moved away from the blanket, sitting a few steps back so she could take it if she wanted. From the shadows, the girl's mind fought itself. One part screamed to stay hidden. The other whispered that warmth could mean survival. The smoke stung her eyes, and a small cough escaped her lips before she could stop it. Daniel's head turned instantly toward the sound, but he didn't move closer. He just gave a small nod, like he was letting her know it was okay to come out. She stayed where she was, but her body leaned forward slightly. Her bare feet shifted on the cold ground. The blanket looked softer than the stone she was sitting on. The warmth from it seemed to call to her through the freezing air. A distant sound broke the moment. Footsteps, heavy and fast. Somewhere in the ruins, Daniel's eyes narrowed. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. He glanced at the girl, then at the shadows around them, without thinking. He positioned himself between her and the sound. His hand rested lightly on his weapon knot. To aim at her, But to protect her, the girl noticed. This monster wasn't attacking her, he was guarding her. The thought was strange, uncomfortable. But it made her hesitate less. Daniel glanced back over his shoulder. His eyes meeting hers in the faint firelight, he nodded toward the blanket. Again, for a moment, she stared at him, her small body trembling from cold and fear. Then, slowly, she crawled forward, every movement tense. Her hands touched the edge of the blanket, was warmer than she expected. She pulled it around her shoulders quickly. The rough fabric scratched her skin, but the heat it gave made her sigh. Almost without meaning to, Daniel didn't smile or speak, he just stayed near, scanning the dark streets for danger. The girl kept watching him from the corner of her eye. He didn't seem like the monster from the stories, but she wasn't ready to believe that yet. Somewhere deep inside, though, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the enemy at all. The blanket was warm, but fear was still colder. The young alien girl sat curled in the rubble, holding the fabric tightly around her shoulders, every breath made. A small white cloud in the air, her eyes never left the human, this strange creature who had not attacked her, who had given her warmth instead. She remembered her mother's voice from long ago. If you ever see a human run, her mother had warned, they smile to trick you. Then they take you away. That warning had lived in her bones for years. And yet, here she was, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke, oil, and something else, something human. Daniel, sitting a few meters away, tried not to look at her too much. He knew eye contact might scare her instead. He focused on the small fire he had built from broken wood and scraps of old furniture. The flames flickered in the wind, casting strange shadows on the cracked walls. He placed a small pot over the fire and poured in water from his canteen. The sound of boiling began to rise slowly. He reached into his pack and took out a few ration bars. Breaking them into smaller pieces and dropping them into the pot, the girl's nose twitched. She tried to hide her reaction, but the smell was too much. It was rich, warm, and nothing like the dry, bitter leaves she had eaten the last 2 days. Her stomach tightened painfully, making a soft sound she hoped he hadn't heard. Daniel noticed, but he didn't say a word. He stirred the pot and let the smell drift toward her. After a few minutes, he carefully placed the pot on the ground between them. He then slid it closer, just enough so she could reach if she wanted, to show he meant no harm. He leaned back, giving her space. The girl's fingers twitched on the blanket. This could be a trick, she told herself. What if the food was poisoned? What if it made her weak, so he could carry her away? But the steam rising from the pot curled in the cold air like a soft hand calling her closer. Her hunger was stronger than her fear. She crawled forward slowly, her knees scraping against the broken stone. Her glowing eyes flicked up to him once he was still watching the shadows, not her, when she reached the pot. She grabbed the spoon and took a small bite. It was warm, salty, and strange. Her mouth wanted more before her mind could stop it. She ate quickly, her hands shaking. For a moment, she forgot to be afraid. Daniel smiled faintly. He knew hunger could make anyone forget their walls for a few minutes, but he also knew trust wasn't built in one night. When she finished, she pushed the pot away, almost as if she was ashamed of taking it. He pointed to himself and said slowly, "Daniel." She stared at him, her head tilted. He repeated it again, "Daniel," tapping his chest. She understood he was giving her his name, but she didn't want to give hers. Names were important, they made you real to someone. She stayed silent, pulling the blanket tighter. Outside, the night seemed endless. The wind carried distant sounds, explosions. Far away, the hum of machines, the echo of shouts. Daniel knew they were still in danger, but for now, the small fire and the blanket gave them a fragile bubble of safety. He took out a small flashlight and aimed it at the ground. From his pocket, he pulled a folded piece of paper, an old map. He marked a spot with his finger, showing her where they were. Then he pointed far to the east, where safety might be. She didn't understand the details, but she understood the direction. Her eyes narrowed, as if asking, "Why show me this?" Daniel pointed at her, then at himself, then made a walking gesture with 2 fingers. The meaning was clear. "We go together." She shook her head sharply. Her people had told her humans only traveled with captives. He didn't argue, he just nodded, and returned to watching the shadows. The fire burned low, and the air grew colder. The girl lay on the blanket, her body tense, eyes still on him. She expected him to sleep so she could run. But he didn't close his eyes, not once. Every sound made him turn his head. Every gust of wind made his fingers twitch near his weapon at some point. She realized something strange. He wasn't guarding himself from her. He was guarding her from something else. That thought made her chest feel tight in a way she didn't understand. As the first light of dawn began to touch the broken rooftops, a far-off noise reached them, one she recognized. Boots, many boots, moving quickly. Daniel's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. He stood and motioned for her to get up. She hesitated, clutching the blanket. His voice was firm but not harsh, a low urgency that told her they couldn't stay. She didn't know why she followed him. Maybe it was the blanket. Maybe it was the way he hadn't hurt her when he had the chance. Or maybe it was because, deep down, she wanted to believe he wasn't a monster after all. Together, they slipped away into the maze of ruins, the blanket trailing behind her like a thin, silent flag in the morning wind. Asterisk, the ruins felt colder in the early light. The smoke from the fires had thinned, but the smell of burnt metal still clung to the air. Daniel moved quickly but carefully, keeping low and scanning every street before crossing. The alien girl followed a few steps behind, clutching the blanket around herself like armor. She didn't know why she was still with him. Every step felt dangerous. Her people could see her with the human and think she was a traitor. But every time she slowed down, the sound of boots and voices in the distance made her legs move again. Somehow, the human seemed safer than being alone. They reached a half-collapsed building and slipped inside. Dust floated in the dim light. Daniel closed the door as quietly as he could and leaned his rifle against the wall. The girl crouched in a corner, her glowing eyes watching him closely. He pulled a small pouch from his pack and opened it. Inside were a few ration bars and a packet of dried fruit. He broke one of the bars in half and set it down between them. Then he pushed the fruit toward her. His movements were slow and open, showing her he had nothing to hide. She looked at the food but didn't touch it. Her mind whispered warnings. What if it's poisoned? What if it's meant to make you weak? Her stomach growled loudly, betraying her thoughts. Daniel noticed. But he didn't smile or laugh. He simply pushed the food a little closer. Finally, she picked up a piece of dried fruit. She sniffed it first, then took a tiny bite. It was sweeter than anything she'd tasted in months. She froze, wondering if sweetness could hide danger. Her eyes flicked up to him. He was eating his half of the ration bar without hesitation. If he meant to poison her, he would be poisoned too. That thought made her take another bite. And then another. In minutes, the food was gone. Her hunger didn't care about pride or fear, only cared about filling the empty ache inside her. Daniel wiped his hands on his uniform and pulled something from his pocket. It was a small, worn photo of a smiling human child. He held it out to her. She leaned closer, without realizing it. The child had bright eyes and a grin that showed missing teeth. Daniel tapped the picture, then tapped his chest, saying something softly, probably his daughter's name. The way his voice changed told her this child was important to him. She didn't know why he was showing her this. Maybe he was telling her he understood what it meant to care for someone small. Or maybe he wanted her to know he wasn't just a soldier. He was also a father. Still, she kept her name to herself. Her mother had always said names were power. But when Daniel pointed at her and asked gently, she hesitated. The warmth of the blanket, the taste of the food, and the way he'd shielded her earlier, it all pressed against her fear. She whispered her name so quietly it almost wasn't a sound. Daniel repeated it slowly, carefully. It sounded strange in his human voice, but he didn't make fun of it. Instead, he nodded, like he was making a promise to remember before she could think about it. The sound of metal clanging outside made them both freeze. Daniel's eyes hardened, and he motioned for her to stay low. Footsteps crunched on rubble nearby too close. He moved toward the window and peeked through a crack. Two figures in dark armor were moving down the street, scanning the ruins. The girl recognized them, not humans, but her own people's soldiers. She thought they might help her. But the look in their eyes was not kindness. It was cold, sharp, and searching for someone to blame. One of them shouted something in her language. She stiffened. They were calling for survivors, but not to rescue them. Daniel's hand rested on his rifle, but he didn't fire. Instead, he waited until the soldiers moved past the building. Then he turned to her, his eyes asking a silent question: stay or run? Her fear answered for her on. She nodded quickly, and together they slipped out the back of the building. The streets ahead were still dangerous, but for now they had each other, and the strange truth was starting to grow in her mind. Maybe the monster she feared was the only one trying to keep her alive. The cold morning air was sharp in their lungs as Daniel led the way through the shattered streets. The girl followed close, her small feet silent on the broken stones. The blanket trailed behind her like a shadow, but she refused to let go of it. The voices behind them grew louder. She could hear her own language commands shouted with force. Her chest tightened. Those voices belonged to her people's soldiers, yet they sounded more like hunters than rescuers. Daniel glanced back and caught the worry in her glowing eyes. He knew the danger was closing in. His instincts told him to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between them and the patrol. They turned down a narrow alley. The walls were cracked, and vines crawled through the stone. Daniel slowed, listening. The footsteps were following fast. Closing the gap, the girl's heart pounded. Part of her wanted to run toward the voices to believe they would help, but another part remembered how cold their eyes had looked when she last saw them. She had heard the stories of what they did to those who had been near humans. It was not rescue, it was punishment. Daniel found a gap in the wall and pushed her toward it. She slipped through, the blanket catching on a nail and tearing slightly. Daniel followed, pulling the blanket free before it could trap her. They emerged into what had once been a marketplace, now a graveyard of broken stalls and scattered debris. The sound of boots hitting stone echoed behind them. Daniel swore under his breath and grabbed her hand for the first time. She stiffened at the touch, but his grip was steady, not crushing. He pulled her behind a fallen column as a shadow passed across the alley they had just left, through a crack in the wall. The girl saw two soldiers scanning the area. Their helmets gleamed faintly, and their weapons were ready. One of them kicked aside rubble, muttering something about the human. Her stomach twisted. They were here for him, and anyone with him. Daniel waited until they moved farther down the street before signaling to move again. They slipped from cover to cover: broken statues, burned-out carts, walls with holes large enough to hide behind. Every step was a test of silence. Every breath was slow, controlled. But then her foot hit a loose piece of metal. The clang echoed in the dead market like a bell. Daniel froze. So did the soldiers. One of them shouted, and the sound of rushing footsteps filled the air. "Run," Daniel said sharply. They sprinted through the ruins, weaving between collapsed buildings. The girl's legs burned, but fear pushed her faster. Daniel stayed just behind her, glancing back every few seconds. They reached a street where the ground had cracked open into a deep pit. A half-collapsed bridge spanned it, swaying slightly. Daniel didn't hesitate. He lifted the girl into his arms and started across. The old planks creaked under his weight. The soldiers appeared at the far end, shouting threats in a language Daniel didn't understand. Halfway across, a plank snapped under his boot. The girl gasped, gripping his uniform tightly. Daniel shifted his weight, balancing on the next plank, and kept moving. The soldiers didn't dare follow onto the unstable bridge. Instead, they fired, bullets striking the wood and stone around them. A splinter grazed the girl's cheek. Daniel shielded her with his body. Pushing forward until they reached the other side, they ducked into a crumbling building, the air inside damp and cold. Daniel set her down. His breathing heavy, she looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. This wasn't the way a monster acted. This was the way someone acted when they wanted to keep you alive. Outside, the soldiers' voices faded slowly. They had lost the trail for now. Daniel leaned against the wall, eyes scanning for their next path. The girl clutched the torn blanket and realized she didn't want to be apart from him, not yet. The building was quiet, except for their breathing. Dust drifted in the pale light from a hole in the roof. The girl sat against the wall, holding the torn blanket close. Her cheek still stung where a splinter had grazed her. Daniel knelt in front of her, his movement slow. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small bottle of water and a folded cloth, without touching her. He dipped the cloth and held it out. She hesitated, then took it and pressed it to her cheek. The cool water felt good, washing away the sting and the dirt. Daniel's eyes scanned the room as she cleaned herself. He listened for any sound of soldiers. But outside, the streets were silent, except for the wind moving through broken walls. When she finished, he took the cloth back and packed it away. Then he reached for another ration bar, broke it in two, and gave her the bigger half. She looked at it, then at him. This time, she didn't hesitate. Hunger had stopped being something she could hide. They ate quietly. Daniel chewed slowly, but his eyes kept returning to her, making sure she was all right when their meal was done. He pulled something small from his pocket. It was the same photo of the smiling human child he had shown her before. He placed it between them on the dusty floor. Then he tapped his chest, saying his daughter's name again. The girl studied the picture. She didn't understand all the details, but she could see the warmth in his eyes when he spoke of the child. Maybe this was why he had helped Herbie, because she reminded him of his own. Her fingers tightened on the blanket. Slowly, she said her own name for the second time. This time, she said it clearly. Daniel repeated it softly, like he was testing the shape of the word. He didn't laugh or make it sound strange. Instead, he nodded. It was a simple thing, but it made her chest feel lighter. Still, she knew trust was dangerous. A moment of trust could be the step before betrayal. She had learned that too many times already. Daniel began drawing in the dust with his finger. He made a rough map, 2 dots connected by a line. 1 dot for here, the other for somewhere farther away. He pointed at her, then at the far dot. It was clear he wanted to take her somewhere safe. She narrowed her eyes. Safe could mean anything, but the memory of the soldiers' cold voices told her that staying here was worse. Before she could decide, a sound came from outside, soft but close. Daniel moved to the window and looked out. 2 alien civilians were walking past, carrying baskets. They glanced toward the building. The girl froze if they saw her with him. Word would spread quickly. Daniel pulled back from the window and waited until they passed. Then he looked at her. There was no speech, just a silent question in his eyes. Do you trust me enough to keep going? Her mouth didn't answer, but her actions did. She stood, tightened the blanket around her shoulders, and stepped toward the doorway. Daniel nodded once. It wasn't full trust, yet more like a thin thread holding them together. But sometimes a thin thread was enough to start. As they stepped out into the light, the wind caught the edges of the blanket. It fluttered like a small banner between them, not of ownership, but of something fragile. Something that might grow if it wasn't broken. The sun was only a pale glow on the horizon when they reached the edge of the ruins. A wide river cut through the land ahead. Its surface shimmered with early light, but the current was strong. The only way across was an old suspension bridge swaying in the cold wind. Daniel stopped and studied it. Some of the wooden planks were missing. Others hung loose by rusted nails, but there was no other crossing for miles. Behind them, faint voices echoed, searchers, still hunting. The girl's grip on her blanket tightened. She had never liked heights. The bridge stretched over a drop that seemed to go on forever before the water below. Her eyes darted to Daniel. She expected him to suggest they turn back. Instead, he crouched down so they were at the same level. He pointed to the far side of the bridge, then at her, then at himself. "We go together." She shook her head. Her legs felt heavy, but the sound of the voices behind them was growing louder. If they stayed, the soldiers would find them. Daniel glanced back. Then, without a word, he stepped onto the bridge first. The planks groaned under his boots, but he tested each one before moving halfway across. He turned and held out his hand to her. She stood at the edge, frozen. The blanket flapped wildly in the wind. Her heart pounded, not from the soldiers this time, but from the drop below. He didn't call to her. He just waited, steady, letting her choose. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped onto the first plank. It shook under her weight. She moved slowly, eyes locked on his. Every step felt like it might be her last. When she reached him, he took her hand, not tight, but firm enough to guide her. They moved together, the wind cutting through their clothes halfway across. A shout came from the far bank. 3 soldiers appeared from the trees. They raised their weapons. Daniel reacted instantly, pulling the girl to one side as bullets ripped through the air. One plank shattered, falling into the rushing water below. He kept her behind him, using his body as a shield with his free hand. He fired short bursts to ward the soldiers, not to kill, but to drive them back. The girl clung to him, her fear of the fall forgotten. Now the only thing she feared was losing him. When the soldiers retreated into cover, Daniel didn't waste a second. They ran the last stretch of the bridge. His boots slammed against the planks, each one threatening to give way. At the far side, he pushed her ahead. They both stumbled onto solid ground. Gasping for air, the girl turned to look back. The bridge swayed violently in the wind. The soldiers on the other side shouted in frustration, unable to cross. Daniel didn't look back. He was already scanning the path ahead. But she looked at him differently now. He had risked the fall, the bullets, everything just to get her across. Her people had always said humans were dangerous. She still believed that was true, but maybe danger wasn't the same as cruelty. Maybe danger could also mean protection, and maybe, she was starting to trust him more than she feared him. The forest on the far side of the river was quieter. No ruins, no broken walls, just tall trees swaying in the cold morning wind. Daniel slowed their pace, listening for any sign of pursuit. But the bridge had bought them time. The soldiers' voices were now far away, swallowed by distance and water. The girl walked beside him, still clutching the torn blanket. It was dirty now, frayed along one edge, but it was hers. Every thread of it carried the warmth of that first night, the night she thought the human was a monster. The night he gave her the only thing he could spare, his own warmth. They reached a clearing where a small camp stood. 2 human medics stepped forward when they saw Daniel. One of them spoke quickly into a radio, calling for transport. The other knelt in front of the girl, offering clean water. She hesitated, looking to Daniel first. He gave a small nod. And only then did she take it. The medics checked her for injuries when they tried to take the blanket to clean it. She pulled it tighter around herself. Daniel raised a hand to stop them. "She keeps it," he said firmly. The medics looked confused, but they didn't argue. A transport vehicle rumbled into the clearing. The girl realized this was where they would part. Daniel's mission would pull him back into danger. Her path would take her somewhere safe. Far from the ruins, she climbed into the vehicle slowly. The blanket still wrapped tight before the door closed. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright, not with fear now, but with something heavier. She stood and stepped down again. Walking toward him for a moment, she held the blanket out to him. It was her way of returning what he had given, but he shook his head. "It's yours now," he said softly. Her throat felt tight. In her language, she whispered something that meant thank you for seeing me as more than an enemy. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the look in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had found safety in the unlikeliest place. She climbed back into the vehicle as it began. To roll away, she pressed her face into the blanket. It smelled of smoke, of wind, and of the man who had stood between her and danger. She didn't know if she would ever see him again. But she knew the blanket was more than cloth now. 'Twas a promise that somewhere out there, even in a war, there could be hands that gave instead of took, and hearts that protected. Instead of destroyed, Daniel watched until the vehicle disappeared into the trees. Then he turned back toward the ruins. The day's danger waited for him. But for a moment, his chest felt a little warmer. Because in a war where trust was rare, he had given a piece of his to someone who might carry it forever. Asterisk.